It was a dark, stormy night when something shocking happened. No one was around, and the streets were nearly empty. The wind howled through the city, rattling windows and bending trees. But there was something more troubling beneath the howling wind, the faint sound of desperate cries echoing from the depths of the city's forgotten tunnels. A tiny voice, weak but full of terror, begged for help. Oh my God, what was that sound? A man walking home after a long, tiring day of work froze in his tracks. His hand was on the doorknob, ready to step inside and escape the rain, when he heard it, again. The faint cry. He looked around, confused, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't the usual noise of the city, this was different. It sounded like a dog, in pain. His heart raced. Could it be? Without thinking twice, he pulled his coat tighter and stepped back out into the rain, following the sound. The city streets were dark, the kind of dark that made you feel like something was wrong. The echoes of the cries grew louder as he walked, guiding him toward an old, forgotten alleyway. The smell of the wet pavement mixed with something else, a decaying, rotten stench that made him pause for a moment. He didn't know why, but something in the pit of his stomach told him this wasn't just a stray dog looking for food. Something far worse was waiting ahead. He turned the corner and the noise stopped. Silence. For a split second, everything around him was still. Then, there it was again, one last desperate cry from somewhere below. The sound seemed to be coming from the ground itself. The man's gaze dropped to a small, rusted grate in the pavement. That's when he saw it, two tiny eyes staring back at him, wide with fear. A dog. It was trapped. The poor thing, alone, abandoned, and shaking from the cold, was stuck somewhere deep in the sewer. Without thinking, he bent down and peered closer. The dog's eyes locked onto his, as if it could see him through the dark metal. It was terrified, its tiny body shivering, but its gaze never wavered. A silent plea. The man's chest tightened. This dog, whatever it had been through, was not going to survive here. Not like this. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The rain fell harder now, the cold creeping into his bones, but his mind was focused entirely on the dog below. There was no time to waste. Without a second thought, he ran to a nearby shop, found a crowbar, and rushed back to the sewer grate. His hands were shaking from the cold and adrenaline, but he didn't stop. The sounds of the dog's breathing echoed in his ears as he worked quickly, prying the grate open with all his strength. Finally, with a loud, painful creak, the grate came loose. He dropped to his knees, his heart pounding, and peered into the darkness below. The dog's eyes were the only thing visible in the thick shadows, still locked on him, still full of fear. He reached down, hesitating for only a moment before gently, carefully pulling the dog from the hole. As he lifted the dog out of the sewer, he could feel its tiny, fragile body trembling in his hands. It was cold, far colder than any dog should be. The dog wasn't moving much, just lying there in his arms, too weak to even make a sound. The man's heart broke. He couldn't imagine how long this dog had been stuck down there, abandoned by whoever had thrown it away. How could someone leave it there? How could anyone be so cruel? He didn't even know the dog's name, but as he cradled it in his arms, he promised himself he wouldn't let it die here. Not now. Not when he'd come this far. He held the dog tighter, feeling its tiny heart thudding weakly against his chest. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if that was even true. With no time to waste, he stood up, the dog still shivering in his arms, and started walking toward his car. The cold wind bit at his face, but he didn't care. He just needed to get the dog help. He was going to make it. He had to make it. But as he took the first few steps, a sickening thought gnawed at him. What if it was too late? What if the dog didn't make it out of this alive? His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The dog lay motionless in his lap, its shallow breathing the only sound breaking the heavy silence in the car. The rain kept pounding against the windshield, blurring his vision. He couldn't stop thinking about how cold the dog had been when he pulled it out of the sewer, how small and fragile it felt in his arms. The dog's body was limp, its eyes barely open, flicking between consciousness and unconsciousness. "Please don't give up on me now," he whispered to the dog, trying to keep his voice calm. He couldn't afford to panic. But everything inside him was screaming. What if it was too late? What if he hadn't gotten to the dog in time? He forced himself to focus on the road ahead, speeding toward the nearest veterinary clinic. There was no time to waste. The man kept glancing down at the dog, trying to reassure himself that it would be okay. The dog's breathing was so faint, so shallow that it seemed almost like a dream. Was this real? Could a living creature really be that fragile? The thought weighed heavily on him as he drove faster, swerving around potholes and puddles, the rain making everything seem even more urgent. It wasn't until he reached the vet's office that he finally stopped, his heart still racing. He ran inside, carrying the dog in his arms, his movements sharp and frantic. His shoes splashed against the wet floor as he entered the clinic, the cold air pressing down on him. "Please, I need help." The words came out almost like a plea, desperation edging his voice. The receptionist looked up, startled, but quickly moved into action. "Get him in here, quick," she urged, rushing toward the back of the clinic. The man followed, every step feeling like a weight, every second making him wonder if they would make it in time. As the door to the treatment room swung open, the vet quickly stepped forward, his hands already moving to examine the dog. The man could hardly keep his eyes off the dog, still lying so still in his arms, its tiny chest barely rising. The vet didn't say a word, just worked quickly, his experienced hands moving over the dog, checking for any signs of life. His expression was calm but focused, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "What happened?" the vet asked, glancing up for the first time. I found him in the sewer. He was trapped. I don't know how long he's been there, but he wasn't moving. I don't know how he's even alive." The man's voice trembled, the fear creeping into his words. He didn't know how to explain it, he didn't understand what was happening. The dog felt like a lifeless, fragile thing in his arms, but somehow, there was still hope. There had to be hope. The vet nodded, not pausing in his work. He carefully checked the dog's pulse and heart rate, and then his eyes flickered back to the man. "It's bad," he said softly, his voice low but steady. "This dog is in shock. It's been in severe distress for too long, and his body's temperature is dangerously low. We'll do what we can, but you need to be prepared. The next few hours will be critical." The man's chest tightened as the vet's words sank in. "What do you mean? He's going to make it, right?" He didn't know why, but the thought of hearing the vet's answer was almost unbearable. He needed to believe this dog could survive. The vet glanced at him, his face hard to read. "We'll see. It's not a guarantee, but we'll try. We'll give him fluids, warmth, everything we can." The man nodded, biting back the lump in his throat. He wanted to scream, to demand that the vet do more, but he knew this wasn't in his hands anymore. It wasn't his decision. His only role now was to wait, to hope, and to be here, just like he promised the dog he would be. He took a step back, sitting down in the small waiting area, the sound of the vet's equipment beeping softly in the background. He ran a hand through his wet hair, trying to steady his breath. But every time his mind wandered back to the dog, to the fear in its eyes when he first pulled it out of the sewer, the doubt crept in again. What if it was too late? What if the dog's suffering had been too much for it to handle? Minutes felt like hours as he sat there, watching the door, waiting for any sign that the vet would come out. His eyes kept flicking to the clock on the wall, as if the seconds could hold the answers to his questions. Each passing moment felt heavier than the last. Then, finally, the door opened. The vet stepped out, wiping his hands on his coat, his face calm but guarded. He glanced at the man, who immediately shot up, his heart racing. "Is he?" The man couldn't finish the sentence. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "He's still with us," the vet said. "But he's not out of the woods yet. We've stabilized him, but he's still very weak. His chances of surviving depend on how he responds to the treatments over the next few hours. It's too early to tell for sure." The relief that flooded the man's chest was so intense it almost made him dizzy. The dog was still alive. He wasn't too late. But just as quickly, doubt crept back into his mind. How long could the dog hold on? Would it make it through the night? And what was really going on with him? "I'll stay here," the man said, voice barely above a whisper. "I'll wait. Whatever happens, I need to be here for him." The vet nodded, offering a small but understanding smile. "I think that's the best thing you can do. We'll keep you updated." The man found a seat near the door, trying to keep his mind from racing too fast. But in that quiet, sterile room, his mind kept circling back to the dog. What had it been through? Why had it been left in that sewer? What did this dog's life mean to the person who'd abandoned it there? He didn't know, but as the clock ticked on, one thing became clear: this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about something deeper. Something he hadn't expected to find. Hours passed like an eternity. The waiting room was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of papers or the soft hum of a distant machine. The man sat still, his eyes never leaving the door that separated him from the dog. His mind raced with worry, replaying every moment from when he first heard the dog's cries in the sewer to now, when he was sitting here, helpless and waiting. He couldn't shake the image of the dog's terrified face, the way it had looked at him in that dark, damp corner of the sewer. It had been so small, so fragile, and yet there had been something in those eyes, something desperate but also full of trust. Trust that he would save it. But now, as he sat there, a fear clawed at his heart. What if he couldn't? What if it was too late after all? The minutes crawled by, stretching into what felt like hours, until finally the door opened again. The vet stepped through, wiping his hands on his gloves, his face a mix of concern and exhaustion. "Is he?" The man stood up before he could finish his question. The vet hesitated, his eyes flicking to the side for a brief moment before meeting the man's gaze. "He's stable for now. Still weak. The good news is, his body's starting to respond to the warmth and fluids. We've managed to bring his temperature up. But there's still a lot of uncertainty. He's a long way from out of danger." The man's heart pounded in his chest. Still uncertain. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd hoped for more, for something more definitive, something that would take away the gnawing fear in his gut. But at least the dog was alive. At least there was hope. That was all he could hold on to now. "Can I see him?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands were trembling again, and he didn't know if it was from fear or the sheer exhaustion of the day. He just needed to see the dog, to make sure it was real, that it was okay. The vet nodded, gesturing for him to follow. As they walked down the narrow hallway toward the back, the man's mind raced again. What if the dog didn't make it? What if it was all in vain? He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered, pulling at him like a weight in his chest. The vet led him into a small room. The dog was lying on a bed, hooked up to several 4 drips, and covered in soft blankets. Its eyes were closed, but there was a soft rise and fall of its chest. It looked so fragile, so vulnerable, but there was something else there now, something he hadn't seen before. The dog's breathing was steadier, more regular than before, and its body didn't seem as limp as it had when the man first found it. He walked over to the bed slowly, his heart in his throat. He reached out a hand, hesitating just before touching the dog's fur. Was this real? Could this little animal really come back from the edge of death? When his fingers finally brushed against the dog's fur, it was warm, the softness of its coat a stark contrast to the cold, wet mess it had been earlier. The dog's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, it just stared up at him, its gaze still filled with fear but also something more, recognition. It was as if the dog remembered him, remembered the hand that had pulled it from the dark. The man's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know if it was because of relief or because of how strong that connection felt, but something inside him clicked. He didn't know if the dog would make it through the night, but at that moment, he knew he couldn't walk away. He couldn't leave this creature that had fought so hard to stay alive. The dog's tail twitched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It wasn't much, but it was something. The man felt a tear slip down his cheek before he could stop it. This was hope. It wasn't guaranteed, it wasn't certain, but it was hope, and that was all that mattered right now. "I'm here," he whispered, wiping his cheek quickly. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here with you." He stood there for a long moment, just watching the dog breathe, his fingers gently resting on its side. The room felt warmer now, somehow, though the rain continued to pound against the windows outside. Time seemed to slow. In that moment, it felt like everything else faded away, the world outside, the city, the storm. All that mattered was this small, fragile creature that had somehow made it through the worst, and now, somehow, was still fighting to stay alive. But even as he stood there, a nagging feeling stayed with him. There was still so much he didn't know. Why had the dog been in the sewer? Who had abandoned it there? And what did that mean for its future? The man couldn't ignore the fact that there was something bigger at play here. This wasn't just a random stray, not just a lost animal. There was something in the dog's story that was still untold, something darker hiding beneath the surface. And no matter what happened, he was going to find out. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait and hope that the dog, against all odds, would survive this. That it would find the strength to heal, to rise up from the darkness that had been forced upon it. And that, together, they could start a new story, a better one. At least, that's what he believed. The night stretched on, quiet and filled with uncertainty. The man didn't leave the vet's office, not for a single moment. He sat in the sterile waiting room, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions, all centered on that tiny, fragile dog. Every minute felt like a lifetime, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He kept thinking about how the dog had looked at him in that moment, its eyes wide with fear but also a faint spark of trust. Why had it trusted him? He knew he should sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. He couldn't tear his mind away from the dog's plight. The poor thing had been abandoned. Tossed aside like trash, left to rot in a dark, disgusting sewer. But the dog had survived, somehow. Against all odds, it had clung to life. And now, all he could do was wait and hope that it would survive long enough to heal. The minutes ticked by slowly, the silence of the clinic almost suffocating. He glanced at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds pass. Suddenly, the door to the back opened, and the vet stepped into the room again. His face was tired, but there was something else in his eyes, something the man couldn't quite place. "Is he?" The man shot to his feet before he could finish. The vet held up a hand, a small smile on his face. "He's still with us. Barely. His body's holding on. I think we've reached a turning point." The man felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it was faint. Barely alive. But it was more than he could have hoped for, more than he had expected. "I think he's going to make it," the vet continued, his voice soft but reassuring. "But it's going to take time. He's exhausted. His body's been through a lot." The man nodded, trying to find words, but all that came out was a deep, shaky breath. "Can I see him again?" The vet hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the decision, but then nodded. "You can. But don't expect too much. He's still very weak." The man followed the vet down the hallway once again, his steps quick but careful. His heart raced in his chest. Was the dog really going to make it? Was there still hope? When they reached the small room, the dog was still lying on the bed, its body covered with blankets, the steady beep of the heart monitor filling the space. The man walked over to the dog slowly, taking in the sight of the tiny creature. It looked so fragile, so small in that large bed, its fur matted and wet. Its eyes were still closed, and its breathing was shallow, but there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. The dog was twitching slightly, its tail moving ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a sign. The man knelt down beside the bed, gently touching the dog's fur. He wanted to talk to it, to tell it everything would be okay, but he didn't know what to say. All he knew was that he couldn't leave. Not now. Not when the dog was fighting so hard to stay alive. As he sat there, the vet quietly watched from the doorway. He had seen cases like this before. Dogs that were found in impossible conditions, abandoned, forgotten, and yet somehow still fighting. It was a miracle in itself that this little dog had survived being trapped in that sewer for so long. But the vet knew better than anyone, it wasn't over yet. The dog was far from out of the woods. The next 48 hours would be critical. And there was something else on the vet's mind, something he hadn't shared with the man yet. He hadn't wanted to worry him, but now, as he looked at the man sitting beside the dog, he knew it was time to say it. He stepped forward, his voice low. "There's something you should know. We ran a few tests earlier. I'm not sure if you're ready to hear this, but I feel you should know." The man looked up, anxiety immediately flooding his chest. "What is it?" The vet hesitated for a second. "There's a chance this dog has been through more than just neglect. There's some scarring in its lungs, and it looks like it might have suffered some internal trauma at some point. It's not conclusive yet, but it's possible the dog's been in a fight, or worse." The man's heart dropped. A fight? He hadn't considered that. He had been so focused on the dog's immediate survival, on getting it out of the sewer, that he hadn't thought about its past. Who would do such a thing to a helpless animal? "I don't know what happened to him," the vet continued. "But I can tell you that he's been through a lot. Physically, he's been pushed to the edge. Mentally, I can't even begin to guess. But we'll do everything we can to help him." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the truth. The dog had endured more than the man had thought, more than he could have ever imagined. And yet, despite all that pain, all that suffering, it had still fought to stay alive. The man sat there in silence, staring down at the dog. His chest tightened. How could anyone treat an animal like that? How could anyone do something so cruel? His mind raced with images of what the dog might have gone through: pain, fear, loneliness, and then, abandonment in that dark sewer. How could anyone do that to such an innocent creature? He couldn't understand it. He didn't think he ever would. But one thing was clear: this dog needed him. It needed someone to care, to give it a chance at healing. It needed someone who wouldn't give up, who would fight for it the way it had fought for its life. And as the man sat there, his hand gently resting on the dog's side, he made a promise. A promise to himself, and to the dog. "No matter what happens, I'm not leaving you. You're not alone anymore." For the first time, the man felt a sense of peace. He didn't know how long it would take for the dog to heal. He didn't know if it would make it through the night or the next day. But he did know one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. And neither was the dog. The night grew colder, but the man didn't notice. His focus was solely on the little dog, lying so still and fragile in the sterile bed. Every now and then, the dog's chest would rise and fall, a small sign of life, but still, the uncertainty hung thick in the air. The man had barely slept, eyes glued to the dog, watching every slight twitch, every subtle movement. Each sign, no matter how small, felt like a victory, like a piece of hope he could hold on to. Around 3 a.m., the vet returned, looking just as tired as the man felt. His eyes were heavy with the burden of his responsibility, but he kept his voice steady as he approached. "How's he doing?" the man asked before the vet could say a word, his voice almost hoarse from hours of waiting. The vet rubbed his eyes, then glanced at the monitor. "He's hanging on," he said, walking over to the dog's bed. "His vitals are stable, but we're not out of the woods yet. I'm still concerned about his internal injuries. He's a fighter, that's for sure, but his body's been through a lot." The man nodded, his heart sinking slightly. "How much longer could this last?" "You've done everything you can," the vet continued, his tone soft. "It's up to him now. He's a resilient little guy, but we need to keep monitoring him closely." The vet stepped back, making a few notes on his chart, and the man stood in silence, the weight of the situation heavy on his chest. He didn't know how much longer he could take the uncertainty, the waiting, the constant fear that one wrong turn could take the dog away. Just then, the dog made a small, almost imperceptible sound, a soft whimper. The man's heart leapt in his chest, and he immediately knelt down beside the bed, looking at the dog's face. Its eyes were still closed, but its body seemed to twitch slightly, as if reacting to the sound of the man's voice. "Hey, buddy," the man whispered, his voice trembling as he stroked the dog's fur. "It's me. You're gonna be okay. Just hang on a little longer." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, and the man felt his heart sink again, the weight of the uncertainty pressing harder than ever. But then, the dog's tail moved, just a flicker, a tiny motion, but it was enough. It was a sign. The man let out a shaky breath, his hand still resting gently on the dog's side. "You're still with me," he murmured, feeling the tiniest flicker of hope return. The vet stepped over, watching the dog closely. "That's a good sign," he said quietly. "It's still touch and go, but it's a good sign." For the next several hours, the man stayed by the dog's side, not wanting to leave for a second. He couldn't. Not after everything the dog had been through. Not after the bond they'd already formed, however small it seemed. The idea of walking away, of leaving the dog to fight this battle alone, was something he couldn't even consider. This dog had been through hell, and now, it had a chance at a new life. And somehow, that chance was tied to him. As the morning sun began to filter through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the room, the vet returned again. His expression was still cautious, but there was something different about the way he moved. More hopeful, perhaps. More sure of what he was seeing. "I think he's making it," the vet said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm seeing some improvement in his condition. His vitals are more stable, and his body's starting to react better to the treatments. We'll continue to monitor him, but I think he's going to pull through." The man felt a rush of relief flood through him. It was a small victory, but it was enough. After everything the dog had endured, after everything he'd fought for, it seemed like the dog was finally starting to win. The vet left the man alone with the dog for a while, allowing him the space to breathe. The man sat back in the chair, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. He couldn't help but smile, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like forever. "You're going to make it, little one." But even as the man allowed himself to believe that, there was still a lingering question in his mind. The vet had mentioned internal trauma, scarring in the dog's lungs, evidence of some kind of violent past. The man couldn't stop thinking about that. Who had hurt this dog? Who had left it to suffer like this? He glanced down at the dog again, noticing the way its small, fragile form seemed to relax, the breathing a little deeper now. The dog's fur had dried a bit from the warmth of the blankets, and though it was still thin, it was beginning to look less like the broken creature that had been pulled from the sewer hours ago. It was beginning to look like a survivor. The man's thoughts shifted again, and he felt a deep need to protect this animal, to keep it safe. Whoever had left it to die, whoever had caused it pain, didn't deserve to have it in their life. But this dog? This dog deserved a chance to be loved, to be cared for. The man knew that now. He didn't just want to help this dog survive, he wanted to give it a future. A real, happy future. But the thought kept nagging at him. What about the past? He couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's past wasn't just some cruel twist of fate. It was something more. He had seen it in the dog's eyes, the terror, the distrust. There was more to the story, and he was determined to find out what. But for now, he would focus on the most important thing, getting the dog through this. As he sat there, the dog's body still and peaceful for the first time in hours, the man made another promise to himself. He would be there for this animal, no matter what. He wouldn't let its past define its future. No one would hurt it again. He was going to make sure of that. And as the morning light spilled across the room, for the first time in what felt like forever, the man allowed himself to believe that everything would be okay. For both of them. Days passed, each one filled with more hope but also lingering questions. The man remained by the dog's side, never straying far from the clinic, never allowing the dog to fight alone. The vet's words echoed in his mind, "He's improving, but we can't be sure yet." But each time he saw the dog's tail wag slightly or noticed it taking deeper breaths, his heart soared. It was clear now, the little dog was a survivor. It had fought through things no animal should have to endure, but it had made it this far, and that was enough to give the man hope. In the quiet of the clinic, where the man would sit for hours, there was an unspoken bond forming between them. He didn't need to say much. The dog knew he was there, and the man could feel it too. Every time he stroked its fur, he felt like he was connecting with something deeper, something that went beyond just saving a life. He wasn't just rescuing the dog from the sewer. He was rescuing it from the darkness it had endured for so long, even if that darkness was still a mystery. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the man was sitting beside the dog, his hand resting gently on its small body. The dog's eyes opened slowly, and for the first time, they didn't just look empty or frightened, they looked aware. The man felt a flutter in his chest. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How are you feeling?" The dog's eyes blinked slowly, and then it did something that almost brought tears to the man's eyes. It lifted its head slightly and licked his hand, softly, tentatively, but it was enough to make the man's heart swell. "It remembers me. It trusts me. Good boy," the man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He had never imagined such a small gesture could mean so much. But as the dog settled back onto the bed, its eyes drifting closed once again, the man couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt. The dog's injuries were healing, yes, but there were still so many unanswered questions. There was still that haunting image of the dog lying in the sewer, cold and alone, waiting for someone to find it. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, that the dog hadn't just been abandoned by chance. Someone had hurt it. Someone had left it to die. The man's thoughts darkened as he recalled the vet's words. Internal trauma. What could that have been from? Who could have done such a thing to this innocent creature? He had to find out. The need to know consumed him. He needed to understand what the dog had been through before he could truly help it heal, not just physically, but emotionally. He couldn't ignore that fear, that terror in the dog's eyes every time it woke up from a nap, every time it heard a loud sound. He had to know the full extent of its suffering so that he could help it recover. That night, as he sat with the dog, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would search for answers. He couldn't let the dog's past remain a mystery, not when it had already shown him such trust. The little dog had fought for survival, and the man had fought right alongside it. Now, it was time to fight for the truth. The next morning, he spoke to the vet again. This time, he asked a question he hadn't dared to ask before. "Is there any way to know what happened to this dog?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "What caused the scars? The trauma?" The vet looked at him carefully, as if weighing how much to reveal. He knew the man was trying to piece together the dog's story, but he also knew how painful it could be for the dog, and for the man. Sometimes, some stories were better left untold. But in this case, the vet could see the man's resolve. "I've been looking into it," the vet said slowly. "We can't be 100% sure, but I'm starting to suspect that this dog didn't just fall into the sewer by accident. The trauma it suffered, it looks like it was from something much more violent. The scars in its body, the stress in its system, it points to some kind of abuse." The man's heart clenched. The thought that someone could intentionally hurt a helpless creature filled him with a mixture of anger and sadness. But it also confirmed something he had feared: the dog's pain hadn't ended with its abandonment. The real damage had already been done. The vet continued, "I don't know who did this or why, but I think it's important you understand this dog didn't just suffer from neglect, it suffered from something far darker." The man nodded silently, his fists clenched at his sides. The more he heard, the more determined he became to find the answers. No one had the right to do this to an animal, no one. And now, with the dog fighting to heal, the man felt like he was fighting too. Fighting for its past, for its dignity, for the chance it deserved to have a happy life. Later that evening, after the vet had gone, the man sat by the dog's side again, his mind spinning with the new information. The dog was healing physically, but what about emotionally? What if the scars weren't just on its body? What if they ran deeper? He watched the dog, its small body curled up on the bed, its breathing steady and calm. In that moment, the man understood something. The road to healing wasn't just about medical treatment. It wasn't just about getting the dog to a healthy state. It was about giving it love, patience, and the security it needed to feel safe again. He knew that now, more than ever. The dog was more than just a rescue, it was a partner in healing. And as long as the dog fought, he would fight with it. The man made a vow right then and there that he would never stop. No matter what it took, he would help the dog overcome its past. Together, they would face whatever challenges came next, no matter how difficult or painful. The dog stirred slightly, its eyes half opening once more. It seemed to sense the man's presence, and even in its fragile state, it gave a soft, almost imperceptible wag of its tail. The man smiled softly, feeling a quiet strength fill his chest. "You're not alone anymore." The next few days were a blur of small victories and setbacks. The dog's progress, though steady, was fragile. It was gaining weight, its fur was beginning to look a little healthier, and it even started to sit up on its own, a sign that it was growing stronger. But with each tiny improvement came a wave of worry. The dog still flinched at certain movements or sounds, as though bracing for something. It was as if it had forgotten how to just be at peace. And the man couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's past was still casting a shadow over its recovery. Every morning, he would arrive at the clinic before sunrise. He didn't mind the early hours. Being there for the dog had become as important to him as anything else in his life. Each day, he'd sit beside the bed, talking softly to the dog, telling it stories, trying to fill its world with kindness and comfort. He wasn't sure if the dog could understand every word, but he knew it could feel his presence. It had to. One afternoon, the man sat by the dog's side, watching as the little creature wobbled to its feet. The man's heart leapt in his chest. For the first time, the dog didn't just look confused or fearful, it looked determined. Its body shook with the effort, but there was something in its eyes that hadn't been there before. It was fighting to stand, fighting to take control of its own life. "Good boy," the man whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out, gently placing his hand on the dog's back, steadying it. "You're doing it. You're really doing it." For a moment, the dog wavered, its body trembling as it tried to hold its balance. Then, with one final burst of energy, it steadied itself, standing tall on all four legs. The man held his breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But the dog stayed upright, its legs slightly shaky but still strong enough to hold its weight. Tears welled up in the man's eyes as he watched this miracle unfold before him. The dog had made it this far. Against all odds, it had refused to give up. It was still alive, still fighting, still surviving. The vet entered the room just then, and his eyes widened as he saw the dog standing on its own. "Well, I didn't expect that," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like we've got a real fighter on our hands." The man laughed, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew it. He's not giving up." The vet nodded, his expression softening. "It's amazing how strong animals are. But it's not just about their physical strength, it's their spirit, their will to survive. This little guy's got both." The man nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped down his cheek. He was overwhelmed by the dog's resilience, by how much strength it had shown, even in the face of unimaginable pain. He could feel the connection between them deepening with each passing day. But even as he celebrated this small victory, there was still that gnawing feeling in the back of his mind, the questions about the dog's past. The vet had told him that it was likely the dog had been abused, but that didn't sit right with the man. He had to know more. After a few more days of careful progress, the man finally decided to take the next step. He needed to understand the dog's story, needed to find out who had done this to it, and why. It wasn't just about curiosity, it was about giving the dog a sense of closure, a chance to heal not only physically, but emotionally. He started with a call to local animal shelters, asking if anyone had reported a dog matching the description of the one he had found. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but he had to start somewhere. The search was exhausting. He went through countless records, speaking to shelter workers, visiting animal control offices, and scanning through reports of abandoned dogs. But no one seemed to know anything specific about a dog that looked like his. It was as if the dog had simply appeared from nowhere, cast aside, forgotten. Weeks went by, and just when the man started to lose hope, he got a call from one of the shelters he had reached out to. They had a lead. The dog's microchip had been registered to a family that lived in a nearby town. It had been adopted as a puppy, and then, almost a year ago, it had gone missing. The family had reported it as lost, but they hadn't been able to find the dog since. The man's heart sank. This dog had been part of a family once. The shelter worker continued, "We've tried to contact the family, but they haven't responded to our inquiries. They've moved, and no one seems to know where they are now. But we're still trying." The man listened intently, his thoughts swirling. The dog hadn't just been abandoned by a stranger. It had been lost by someone who had once cared for it, someone who had let it slip away. Had they mistreated it? Had something happened to make them give up on it? But there was still one more thing that stuck in the man's mind, the trauma, the abuse the vet had mentioned. The scars weren't just from neglect, they were from something far darker. He couldn't help but feel that there was more to the story, something the dog wasn't telling him yet. As he hung up the phone, the man's resolve strengthened. He wasn't going to let this story end like this. He wasn't going to stop until he knew the whole truth, until he could give the dog the peace it deserved. He had come so far, and he couldn't turn back now. With a newfound sense of purpose, the man returned to the clinic, determined to help the dog heal, not just physically, but emotionally. He would give it a future, one filled with love and safety, and he would fight to make sure its past never defined who it was. Because this dog, this incredible, brave little survivor, deserved nothing less. As the days grew longer, the man began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. The phone call from the shelter had given him a new lead, but it wasn't enough to fully understand what had happened to the dog. There were still so many unanswered questions, and that lingering mystery continued to gnaw at him. But in the meantime, the dog was making progress, and that gave him hope. Every morning, he would arrive at the clinic, his heart light with anticipation, eager to see how much the dog had improved. The dog was starting to walk more confidently now, each step steadier than the last. It was still a little slow, still cautious, but it was no longer the trembling, broken animal that had first been pulled from the sewer. It was gaining strength, not just in its body, but in its spirit as well. One afternoon, the man sat quietly in a corner of the clinic, watching as the dog carefully padded around the room, its head held a little higher than before. It was a small moment, but it felt like a huge victory. The dog was starting to find its place in the world again. The man's thoughts were interrupted by a soft whine. He looked over to see the dog standing by the door, looking up at him with those big, soulful eyes. There was something in its gaze, something that tugged at his heart. It wasn't just hunger or the need to go outside. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The man walked over, kneeling down to the dog's level. "What is it, buddy?" he asked softly, his voice gentle. The dog took a small step forward, its eyes still locked on the man. Then, without warning, it laid its head on his lap, curling up in a way that seemed almost like a plea for comfort. The man stroked its fur, his fingers brushing through the soft hair as he whispered, "It's okay. I'm right here." In that moment, the man realized something profound. The dog wasn't just healing physically. It was starting to trust again. This simple act of resting its head in the man's lap was a sign that it was beginning to let go of the fear and pain it had carried for so long. It was learning to trust, learning that it didn't have to be afraid anymore. But the man knew that trust was a delicate thing. It would take time. The scars, emotional and physical, couldn't be healed overnight. But as he sat there, feeling the dog's small, steady breaths against his hand, he knew they had already come so far. And they would keep moving forward, together. Later that evening, the man received another call from the shelter. This time, the news was even more unsettling. They had managed to track down the dog's former family, or rather, the people who had once claimed to be its family. The shelter worker explained that they had gotten in touch with the last known address, but when they spoke to the people, they were less than cooperative. They claimed they didn't remember much about the dog, the shelter worker said. They said they had adopted it as a puppy, but after a few months, it ran away. They didn't seem concerned. They didn't even ask about the dog's health. The man's blood ran cold as he listened. How could someone be so indifferent about a dog they had once brought into their lives? It was as if the animal had meant nothing to them. The man felt his fists clench in anger. This dog, the one that had fought so hard to survive, had once been a part of a family that had failed it in every way. They hadn't just abandoned it, they had erased it, like it was nothing more than a forgotten thing. The shelter worker continued, "We don't have much more information. The people moved away shortly after the dog disappeared, and there's no record of them doing anything to try to find it." The man felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The more he learned about the dog's past, the more it seemed like it had never truly been wanted. The more he understood, the more his heart ached for the little creature lying in the clinic, trying to heal. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog from the streets. It was about healing something far deeper. He hung up the phone, staring blankly at the walls of the clinic. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they didn't form the picture he had hoped for. Instead, they painted a picture of neglect, of cruelty, of a dog left behind in every possible way. The man couldn't stand the thought of it. But even in the face of this revelation, he refused to give up. If this dog had survived so much, it deserved to be loved. It deserved to be given a life that was full of care, attention, and kindness. It didn't deserve to be forgotten. Not on his watch. The next day, the man made another decision. He would take the dog in. He would give it a home, a family, and the love it had always been denied. It would never know another day of loneliness or fear. He would be there for it, no matter what. As he stood by the dog's side, stroking its fur gently, he whispered, "You're not alone anymore. I'll be with you. I'll make sure you never have to go through this again." The dog lifted its head at the sound of the man's voice, its eyes filled with trust. It was still fragile, still healing, but it was beginning to believe in the future. The man knew that, in time, the dog would fully recover, but more importantly, it would finally find peace. And as he looked down at the dog, feeling its warmth against his legs, the man realized that he had found something too. He had found a purpose, a connection, something worth fighting for. The dog had shown him that love, trust, and loyalty were worth more than anything he had ever known. From that moment on, he would give everything he had to make sure this dog never had to face another moment of pain. Together, they would build a future, one that was filled with love, laughter, and happiness. And no matter how hard it got, no matter how many times the road seemed impossible, they would face it together. The dog was no longer just a rescue, it was family. And the man wasn't just its savior. He was its forever home. As the weeks continued to pass, the bond between the man and the dog only grew stronger. The dog's progress was nothing short of miraculous. It had gone from trembling in fear at the slightest sound, to confidently walking by the man's side without hesitation. The scars, both physical and emotional, were still there, but they were slowly fading, partly because of the care the man had shown, and partly because the dog was learning that not everyone in the world would hurt it. But as much as the dog was healing, the man couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had promised himself that he would give the dog a life free from pain, but there was still a part of the dog's story that was incomplete, the part that involved its past. He couldn't rest until he knew the truth about what had happened to the dog before it was abandoned. One evening, while sitting on the couch with the dog curled up next to him, the man couldn't help but think back to the day he had found the dog in the sewer. He thought about the lifeless eyes, the way the dog had looked at him as if it were too tired to trust again. That moment haunted him. He could still feel the weight of it, like the dog's pain had seeped into his own heart. The thought of the dog's past haunted him, too. Even though the dog had come a long way since that day, the memories of what had happened to it would likely never fade completely. He had been told about the abuse, the neglect, and the way the dog had been discarded like it didn't matter, but the question still remained. What had driven its family to abandon it? Was it intentional? Had the dog suffered at their hands? There were so many unanswered questions that lingered, and the man knew he had to keep searching. His resolve grew stronger with each passing day. He wasn't going to let the dog's past define its future, but he needed to know what had happened so that he could fully help it heal. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about helping the dog recover, it was about finding justice, too. The man took it upon himself to dig deeper. He called the shelter again, and this time, he insisted on speaking to someone who could help. "I need to know everything," he said, his voice firm but filled with the same determination that had driven him since he first rescued the dog. "Anything that can help me understand what happened. I can't move forward until I know the truth." The shelter worker, understanding his urgency, agreed to look into it further. After a few days of phone calls, emails, and record checking, the shelter worker finally called back with a breakthrough. "I found something," the worker said, her voice a little quieter now, as if hesitant to break the news. "It's not much, but it's something. We were able to trace the dog's previous owners a little more accurately. The family that adopted the dog, they moved away, yes, but we were able to track down their old neighbors." The man's heart raced. "And what did they say?" "They remember the family," the worker replied. "They said the dog had been neglected, even when it was a puppy. They remember seeing it tied up outside, alone for long stretches of time, and they recall that the family didn't seem very concerned about it. But there's more. The neighbors mentioned that, just before the dog disappeared, there had been a lot of shouting. They heard the family arguing. And then, after that, the dog was gone." The man listened intently, his heart sinking with every word. The more he learned, the worse it sounded. It wasn't just that the dog had been abandoned, it seemed to have been mistreated from the start. The shelter worker paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "We don't know exactly what happened, but it's clear the dog wasn't treated well. It was just another part of their life they didn't want to deal with. It's heartbreaking." The man swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. His mind raced as he processed the new information. He had always suspected that something darker was at play, but hearing the confirmation that the dog had been neglected, ignored, and treated as less than nothing, made his blood boil. How could someone do that to an innocent creature? "I need to find them," the man said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "I need to know why. I need to know what made them do this." The shelter worker sighed. "I'm afraid it's not going to be easy. They've moved so many times, and there's no guarantee they'll even speak to you. But I'll help you track down whatever I can." "Please, I have to know the full story," the man insisted. He couldn't leave things like this. Not when the dog had come so far. And so, the search continued. Days turned into weeks, and still, the man didn't give up. He spent his evenings going through records, tracking down addresses, and reaching out to anyone who might have known the dog's previous family. The process was exhausting, but he couldn't stop. He needed answers. Not just for himself, but for the dog. The dog, for its part, had no idea what the man was doing. It was content to rest by his side, slowly becoming more comfortable with its new life. The dog was starting to show its playful side again, running in the yard, wagging its tail when the man came home, and even barking at the squirrels that ran across the fence. It was as though the dog was slowly reclaiming its innocence, finding joy in the little things again. But the man's thoughts were consumed with the past. Every time he looked at the dog, he saw the pain it had endured, and he felt an urgent need to fix that. He had come so far in helping the dog heal, but he couldn't move forward until he understood why it had been hurt in the first place. Finally, one evening, the man received a call that would change everything. "Sir?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the man's heart skipped a beat as he listened. I think we found them." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, each syllable sending a rush of adrenaline through the man's veins. They found them. For weeks, he had been trying to piece together the dog's past, driven by a need for justice and understanding, and now, it seemed like the answers were finally within reach. He quickly gathered his thoughts and forced himself to respond with calm precision. "Who are they? What do you know?" he asked, trying to steady his breathing. The voice on the other end of the line seemed more cautious now. "We were able to track down the last known address, and there was someone there who remembered the family. They've moved again, but we found a contact, a relative who still lives nearby. We've been able to confirm that the family did, in fact, have the dog. The relative is willing to speak with you." The man's heart raced. His mind spun with 100 questions. What would they say? Would they apologize? Or would they try to deny everything? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but one thing was clear: the answers were closer than ever. "I'll meet them," he said, his voice more determined than he had ever felt. "Where do I go?" The shelter worker gave him the address, and the man hung up the phone, his body a mixture of anxiety and determination. He couldn't believe it. After all this time, after everything the dog had endured, he was finally going to come face to face with the people who had let it suffer. The drive to the address felt like it took forever. Every mile was another beat of anticipation in the man's chest. What if they didn't want to talk? What if they tried to lie their way out of it, or worse, what if they didn't care at all? His thoughts were a whirlwind, but he kept his focus on one thing: the dog. He had promised it a better life, and part of that promise meant confronting its past. He wasn't going to let the family's indifference erase the dog's pain. He was going to make sure they faced the consequences for what they had done. When the man arrived at the address, he was met by a woman who looked to be in her late 40s. She had a stern face, her eyes shadowed with years of hard work and struggle. She seemed to be the only one left in the family. She led him inside, but her demeanor was cold, defensive, as if she was expecting trouble. "I'm here to talk about the dog," the man said, his voice steady but firm. The woman's face tightened, but she motioned for him to sit. "I don't know what you think you're going to get out of this, but I don't have much to say. The dog was a problem for us. We didn't want it anymore." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. They didn't want it anymore. He swallowed the anger that rose in his throat. "You didn't just abandon it. You hurt it. I know what you did." The woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands fidgeting. "We did what we could. It wasn't easy. It was always running away, always causing trouble. We couldn't keep it. So, we let it go." The man's heart pounded, fury building with each word. Let it go? Those words were so simple, but they held a world of cruelty. They had cast the dog aside as if it were an object, not a living, breathing creature with its own needs and feelings. "No," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just let it go. You let it suffer. You didn't care enough to make sure it was okay. You didn't even try." The woman's eyes darted to the side, as though searching for an escape. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, less defensive. We had our problems too. It wasn't just the dog. But I never meant for it to end up like this." The man was shocked by the vulnerability in her voice, but he wasn't ready to forgive her. "Not yet. You can't pretend that everything was okay. You didn't protect it. You didn't love it the way it needed." A long silence stretched between them, both of them stuck in a moment of truth that neither could escape. The woman looked away, her expression filled with regret, though whether it was for her actions or the consequences of those actions, the man couldn't tell. "Why did you even take it in the first place?" the man asked, his voice softer now, though still tinged with anger. "If you didn't want it, why adopt it at all?" The woman sighed deeply, a weary sound that filled the room with a sense of defeat. "We thought it would be different. We thought we could handle it, but things just got worse. The dog was never happy. It was always scared, always anxious. It didn't fit in with us. And we didn't know what to do." The man's anger faded slightly, replaced by a heavy sadness. The woman wasn't evil, she was just a person who had made a terrible decision, one that had cost the dog its chance at a good life. "You should have tried harder," he said quietly, the pain in his voice undeniable. "You should have tried to give it a real chance." "I know," the woman whispered, her face softening. "I know I failed it." The man stood up, suddenly feeling tired, like the weight of everything that had happened was finally catching up to him. He didn't know what he had expected from this conversation, an apology, maybe, or some kind of justification for the dog's suffering. But in the end, there was nothing to make it right. No words could undo what had been done. He walked toward the door, glancing back at the woman. "I just want you to know that the dog is safe now. It's being loved. And it will never have to go through anything like that again." The woman nodded, her face unreadable. "I'm glad. I hope it's happy." The man left the house feeling a strange sense of closure, but also an overwhelming emptiness. The answers he had found hadn't brought him peace. They had only confirmed the cruelty of what had happened. As he drove back to the clinic, he couldn't help but think of the dog. It had suffered in silence for so long, and now, it was finally in a place where it was loved, cared for, and safe. But the past would always be a part of its story, something that couldn't be erased. When he arrived back at the clinic, the dog was waiting for him. It trotted over to greet him, wagging its tail, its eyes full of trust and affection. The man bent down and stroked its fur, feeling the warmth of its presence. "No more pain," he whispered softly. "No more fear. You're home now." And for the first time in a long while, he believed it. As the man and the dog settled into their new routine, the days began to feel less heavy. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer consumed the man's every thought. He had done what he could to uncover the truth about the dog's life before him, and though the answers weren't easy, they had helped him understand the pain the dog had suffered. But more importantly, they had allowed him to close that chapter, to leave the past behind. Now, the future felt wide open. Every day was a new opportunity for healing, for both of them. The dog's tail wagged more often now, its movements more playful, its energy less tense. The man noticed small changes in its behavior that filled him with hope. When he'd first found the dog, it had been so fearful, so broken, that it couldn't even look him in the eye. But now, there was trust in those eyes. There was love. It wasn't just about the dog's recovery anymore. It was about their shared journey, the bond that had formed between them. The man had never imagined that rescuing a dog would change his life this much, but it had. It had opened up a world of emotions he hadn't expected. The connection he felt to this animal, an animal that had endured so much pain, was deeper than anything he had ever known. But as time went on, there was still something gnawing at him. The dog was healing, yes, but so much of its pain had been internal. It had suffered from neglect and abandonment, and although it was starting to trust again, there were still moments when it would retreat, when the fear would flicker back into its eyes. One evening, after a long walk in the park, the man sat down on the front steps with the dog resting beside him. The night was calm, the air cool, and the man couldn't help but think about how far they had come. How much the dog had already changed. And yet, there was a lingering sadness in the dog's eyes, one that the man couldn't quite place. "Hey, buddy," the man said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "I know you've been through a lot. And I know it's not easy, but you're safe now. You're loved." The dog looked up at him, its eyes wide and full of a mixture of trust and uncertainty. It seemed as though it was searching for something, answers, reassurance, or maybe just a sign that this life, this peace, was permanent. "I'm here," the man continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together. Always." The dog let out a soft sigh and leaned its head against the man's leg, as if to say, "I believe you." And for the first time in a long time, the man truly believed it too. But then, as if in response to his words, the dog suddenly tensed. Its ears perked up, and it stood, looking toward the street with a slight growl in its throat. The man's heart skipped a beat. It was as if the dog had sensed something, or someone, that had made it uneasy. The man followed the dog's gaze, but there was nothing. No movement. No sign of danger. And yet, the dog remained alert, its body stiff, its eyes fixed on the empty street. "Hey, what's wrong?" the man asked, his voice calm but concerned. He slowly stood up, his hand still on the dog's back, trying to reassure it. The dog whimpered, a low, almost imperceptible sound, as though it was caught in a memory it couldn't shake. The man's heart went out to it. He could feel the dog's distress, its fear of something invisible. He didn't know what was going on inside the dog's mind, but he knew one thing for certain: it was still haunted by its past. And even though it had made so much progress, it wasn't truly free yet. The man crouched down beside the dog, gently cupping its face in his hands. "It's okay," he said softly. "Whatever it is, you're not alone. I'm here." For a moment, the dog just stared at him, its eyes filled with confusion and a kind of longing. Then, as if finally sensing the man's sincerity, the tension in its body began to ease. The dog's growl softened, and it lowered its head, resting it against the man's knee. "I'm not going anywhere," the man repeated, his voice firm, but filled with compassion. "You're safe now." The dog let out a small, relieved sigh, and the man could feel the last traces of fear melt away. There were still moments of doubt in the dog's heart, moments when the past tried to reach out and pull it back, but the man knew that as long as he was by its side, those moments would be fewer and fewer. And then, as the dog relaxed into his embrace, the man made a silent promise to himself, and to the dog. "No matter what, I'll protect you. I'll make sure you never have to face that fear again." Just as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, the man sat back against the steps, the dog curled up beside him. There, in the quiet stillness of the evening, the man realized something profound. Healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about creating a future that was safe, filled with love, and full of trust. It was about giving the dog a chance to be the happy, confident animal it deserved to be. And for the first time in a long time, the man felt at peace. The dog was healing. And so was he. Together, they had come so far, and together, they would face whatever came next. Tomorrow would be another day of recovery, of love, and of growth. And they would face it, side by side. The man and the dog, a family forged in the fires of pain, but now united in love. And for the first time, the man truly believed everything would be okay. Days passed, each one offering new moments of connection between the man and the dog. The dog was no longer just a frightened creature he had rescued from the sewer. It had become a loyal companion, a member of his family. The once broken animal was slowly blossoming into a confident and joyful friend, thanks to the man's unwavering care. One morning, as the man was preparing breakfast, he heard the familiar sound of the dog's paws padding across the wooden floor. He turned to find the dog sitting by the door, its eyes focused on him with a look of expectation. The man chuckled and set down the frying pan, realizing that the dog had learned to associate mornings with something special, time spent together. "Well, I guess someone's hungry," he said with a smile. The dog wagged its tail, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. It wasn't just about food, it was about routine, about stability. The dog had come to trust that every morning would begin the same way, with love, attention, and care. As they sat together, eating breakfast, the dog rested its head on the man's lap, content and calm. The bond between them had deepened even further, and in this quiet moment, the man realized just how much the dog had changed his life. He had never imagined how much joy a dog could bring, or how much he could learn from it. But just as the peace of the morning settled in, the doorbell rang, breaking the calm. The dog immediately tensed, its ears standing upright as its body stiffened. It was as if some distant memory had been triggered by the sound, and the man could feel the tension in the air. "It's okay, buddy," the man said softly, his hand moving to the dog's shoulder in a soothing gesture. He knew the dog still carried traces of its past, moments when fear and anxiety would suddenly rise to the surface. He stood up slowly, trying to reassure the dog with his calm presence. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. The dog barked once, a sharp, nervous sound, and the man could see the conflict in its eyes. Part of it wanted to run, to hide, to escape whatever danger it thought was at the door. But the man wasn't going to let that happen. He had promised the dog that it was safe now, and he meant it. "I've got this," the man said, his voice firm but gentle. He walked toward the door, the dog following closely behind, still uncertain. When he opened it, he was met by the sight of a delivery driver holding a package. "Delivery for you," the man said, reaching for the package, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. It was just a delivery. Nothing to worry about. He turned back to see the dog still standing in the hallway, watching him with wary eyes. "See? Nothing to be afraid of," the man reassured, but there was still a part of him that understood the dog's fear. The dog had been through so much, and even the most innocent of sounds, like a doorbell, could bring back painful memories. He set the package down and walked over to the dog, kneeling beside it. The dog's tail had lowered, its body still a bit stiff. "You're okay," the man whispered, placing a hand on the dog's back. "No one is going to hurt you. You're safe here." The dog looked up at him, its eyes wide, searching for reassurance. For a moment, the man could see the remnants of the fear it had lived with for so long. But then, slowly, the dog's body relaxed. Its tail began to wag, just a little, as if to say, "I believe you." The man smiled, his heart swelling with love for this dog that had come so far. "Good boy," he murmured, standing up and offering the dog a treat. "You're doing great." As he watched the dog nibble on the treat, the man couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. The journey they had been on together had been long, full of challenges and painful truths, but it had also been filled with moments like this, moments of growth, of healing, and of trust. And yet, even as the dog made progress, the man knew that there were still moments when the dog would need extra care, extra love, and extra patience. Healing wasn't linear, and some scars, even those that couldn't be seen, would take time to fade. Later that afternoon, the man took the dog for a walk in the park, where they sat on the grass and simply enjoyed the warm sun. The dog lay next to him, its body fully relaxed, its eyes scanning the surroundings with curiosity instead of fear. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. The man had no illusions. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be setbacks, moments when the dog would still struggle with its past. But as long as the man was by its side, offering love and understanding, he knew they could face whatever came next. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the park, the man reflected on how far they had come. The dog, once broken and lost, had found a home, had found safety, love, and happiness. And in doing so, it had given the man something he hadn't even known he needed, a sense of purpose, a reminder that love could heal even the deepest wounds. "You're my family now," the man whispered, stroking the dog's fur. "And I'll always take care of you." The dog let out a contented sigh, its eyes closing as it nestled closer to the man. In that moment, both of them knew they had found something irreplaceable, a bond that had been forged in the fires of pain, but now was strengthened by love and trust. And as the man looked down at his dog, he knew one thing for certain. Their journey was far from over, but together, they would face whatever came next. Because they had each other, and that was all they truly needed. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. The seasons changed, and with each passing moment, the bond between the man and the dog only deepened. The dog, once so fearful and uncertain, was growing into a confident, joyful creature. It had started to enjoy the simple pleasures of life again, chasing after balls, running through the park, and even meeting other dogs without the usual hesitation. The man had kept his promise to the dog. He had given it a safe place, a loving home, and a future where it could heal, trust, and be happy. But there were moments, even now, when the past would resurface, when the dog's eyes would reflect a brief flash of fear, when it would hesitate before jumping into the car or before meeting new people. The man was always there to reassure it, to remind it that it was loved and protected. One evening, as the man was getting ready for bed, he noticed the dog standing by the window, staring outside. The moonlight bathed the room in a soft, silver glow, and the dog seemed transfixed by something in the distance. The man walked over, standing beside the dog, who didn't turn its head but instead kept its eyes focused on the outside world. "What is it, buddy?" the man asked softly. He followed the dog's gaze, but there was nothing there, just the quiet night, the trees swaying gently in the wind, and the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into the evening. The dog whined softly, its ears twitching. The man gently stroked its back, trying to calm it. "It's okay. There's nothing out there. You're safe here." But the dog wasn't convinced. It growled low in its throat, its body tense, as if someone, was lurking just out of sight. The man's heart skipped a beat. He'd seen the dog react this way before, though never quite as strongly. "Hey," the man whispered, his hand still on the dog's back. "You don't have to be afraid. You're home now." But the dog's anxiety only grew. It started pacing, its tail stiff, its eyes darting from the window to the man and back again. The man stood still, trying to make sense of the dog's unease. He knew this behavior well. It was a reaction to a past it couldn't forget, a past filled with fear and uncertainty. But what had triggered it this time? Suddenly, there was a faint noise, barely audible at first. The man strained his ears. It was a soft scratching sound, almost like something, or someone, was tapping at the window. The man's blood ran cold. Was it possible? Was there someone outside? He rushed over to the window and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. He frowned, his mind racing. The dog was still on edge, but now it was silent, staring intently at the window. The scratching sound had stopped, but something didn't feel right. "Stay here," the man said, his voice steady but firm. He walked to the door, checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. The last thing he wanted was for the dog to feel even more anxious, but he also had to be cautious. He couldn't let his guard down. After a few moments, he returned to the dog, who was still staring at the window. The dog's eyes met his, and for the first time in a long while, the man saw something in them, something that made his heart race with both fear and curiosity. The dog wasn't just afraid. It was warning him. And in that moment, the man understood. This wasn't just about the dog's past trauma. It was about something happening right here, right now. Something the dog had sensed, something the man had missed. "What is it?" the man whispered, bending down to the dog's level. "What's out there?" But the dog didn't answer. It just kept its gaze fixed on the window, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The man felt a chill creep down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was out there. He had no idea what it was, but in that instant, the dog's instinct was the only thing he could trust. He wasn't going to take any chances. Taking a deep breath, he moved away from the window and grabbed his phone from the counter. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number of a local security company. He needed to be sure. He needed to make sure nothing could get through, nothing could hurt the dog or him. "Hi," he said when someone picked up. "I need to have security set up in my home. Now." The operator on the other end assured him they'd have someone there as soon as possible. The man thanked them, his mind racing. He didn't know what was happening, but he was going to make sure that nothing could get to them, nothing could hurt the dog. He returned to the window, keeping his eye on the yard, his thoughts a blur of worry. The dog had calmed a little, but it still remained on edge, its eyes never leaving the window. For the rest of the night, the man stayed vigilant, the unease settling into his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. something that was connected to the dog's past. And in that quiet, tense moment, the man knew that the dog's journey wasn't over. The road to healing was far from complete. Whatever the dog had sensed, whatever danger had resurfaced, it was something they would have to face together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries. But whatever came, the man was ready. Because now, more than ever, he knew that nothing, not even the ghosts of the past, could tear them apart. They were in this together, and nothing would change that. The night passed slowly, the silence in the house almost suffocating. The man lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the dog still close by, curled up in its usual spot. The unease from earlier had not faded. He kept replaying the strange events in his mind, the sudden uneasiness in the dog, the scratching sound at the window, the deep growl that had reverberated through the room. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. When morning came, the man made his way downstairs, his mind still heavy with worry. The dog was waiting by the door, as usual, its eyes alert, its ears perked. Even after a restless night, the dog remained watchful, its instincts as sharp as ever. The man offered the dog a reassuring pat, but he could feel the tension in its body. Whatever had triggered the dog's fear last night, it hadn't gone away. After a quick breakfast, the man decided to go outside and investigate. The yard, usually peaceful, felt different today. The air was thick with anticipation, and every rustling leaf seemed like a warning. The man moved cautiously, keeping an eye on the dog, who stood beside him, eyes darting toward the edges of the yard. They walked around the perimeter of the yard, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches. The man paused, squinting at the ground, but the dirt and grass were undisturbed. Everything looked normal. But then, just as he was about to turn back, something caught his eye. A small patch of dirt near the back gate had been disturbed, the earth slightly overturned. The man's heart skipped a beat. He crouched down, inspecting the ground. There were no clear tracks, but the soil was soft, as if something, or someone, had recently been there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a wave of dread through the man's chest. "Stay close," he whispered to the dog, his voice low and cautious. The dog had already noticed the change in the man's demeanor and was now standing at attention, its body stiff with alertness. The man stood and walked toward the gate, his hand gripping the latch. As he opened it, he felt a strange sense of dread settle in. What was it? What was waiting for them on the other side? He peered through the crack in the gate, his eyes scanning the street. But again, there was nothing. The neighborhood was calm, just like it had always been. But then, just as he was about to close the gate, he heard a faint sound, a soft rustling in the bushes across the street. The man froze, his breath caught in his throat. The dog, too, tensed, its ears pointing forward, eyes narrowing as it stared in the direction of the noise. "What is it?" the man murmured. His grip on the gate tightened, and his senses heightened. He didn't know what to expect, but he could feel something in the air, a presence, something that didn't belong. The rustling stopped. The dog growled softly, its low voice vibrating with unease. The man's heart began to race. This wasn't just a random sound. Something, or someone, was there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. He took a slow step back, keeping his eyes fixed on the bushes. And then, out of nowhere, he heard it again, a soft scrape of something moving along the ground, a sound so faint it could have been the wind. But the dog's reaction said otherwise. Its hackles were raised, and it was barking now, loud and urgent. The man's mind raced. He wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. With the dog at his side, the man took a deep breath and stepped forward, determination settling in. If there was danger, he would face it. But this time, he wouldn't be alone. Not with the dog by his side. They moved toward the bushes, the dog's growls growing louder with each step. The man's pulse quickened, every instinct telling him that whatever was out there, it wasn't something he could ignore. When they reached the bushes, the man stopped, his breath shallow, his body tense. He peered through the leaves, but before he could see anything clearly, the dog darted forward, its bark loud and fierce. The man reached out, but the dog was already moving, disappearing into the shadows. "Wait! Stay back," the man called out, but it was too late. With a surge of panic, the man followed, his heart racing as he pushed through the bushes after the dog. His mind was clouded with fear. What if something had come back from the dog's past? What if this was it? What if it was someone who had come to harm them? And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The dog went silent. The man's footsteps faltered, his breath caught in his throat. He rounded the corner of the bushes and found the dog standing at the edge of the yard, staring at something with its body still alert. The man's gaze followed, and then his stomach dropped. There, standing in the shadow of a tall fence, was a figure. A person. The figure was barely visible, hidden by the darkness, but the man could see enough to know that it wasn't someone he recognized. The figure stood motionless, watching them. A chill ran down the man's spine. The dog growled again, a deep, menacing sound. The man's heart thudded in his chest. He had no idea who this person was or what they wanted, but one thing was certain: this wasn't just a coincidence. The dog had known something was wrong. And now, standing here in front of this mysterious figure, the man realized that their story was far from over. As the man stood there, frozen, the figure in the shadows began to move closer. And in that moment, he knew that they were about to face something far darker than they had ever imagined. As the figure stepped closer, the man and the dog stood ready for whatever challenge lay ahead, united in their bond and determination. But what happens next? Only time will tell. If you want to find out what happens next and hear more thrilling stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. You don't want to miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. Stay tuned for more heartwarming and suspenseful tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this adventure.